everyone. Hello, welcome back to another episode of Call Time. My name, as always, is Brian M. Davis. Joining me today is a past guest of mine, Daniel Farrands. Previously, we talked about Halloween, but this ain't about Halloween. This is more along the lines of his more recent work. Two movies that he recently just premiered just over the past year: Ted Bundy, American Boogeyman, and AILEEN Wuornos.
I'll help you. Wuornos.
Wuornos. There we go. It's a little hard for me to pronounce certain names. AILEEN Wuornos, American Boogeywoman. Like two companion movies that were essentially back to back, and even filmed back to back in the terms of that. So, Daniel, I hope you have you've been having a good New Year.
So far, so good. You know, a couple snags here and there, but we're working it out. So, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I know last time that you were on the podcast, we were going to talk about your recent two movies that you made during but we kind of ran out of time because Halloween.
Sure, yeah, we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. So let's go right into it. So how did the background for these two movies actually come about?
Let's see. It's you're taking me back a little. It's funny, even though they're newer movies, it feels like I made them a while ago. I think just so much has happened in the world and in everybody's lives. It just seems like these movies were longer than they actually were. But the origin of them was that I was approached by a producer that I'd worked with on some of my other projects, Jared, and he was working with a company that was distributing films, and they had an idea that they would like to do something on the Ted Bundy story. And my initial, and Ted Bundy being the kind of infamous American serial killer, my initial reaction to this, to be honest, was, good grief, there's been so many movies and documentaries and things on Ted Bundy, and I just I don't know what else we could possibly say about this creep. And I just didn't love the idea of doing something else on this character. But when I did go away and I thought about it, I rewatched some of the movies and documentaries that had been done in the past few years. And I have to say, the thing that sort of bothered me, and this is no disrespect to anybody else's film or anybody's interpretation of that story, that true story, is that, Bundy was not a nice guy. He wasn't a folk legend or a hero or something. He was a monster. And I thought, and I'm not saying anybody portrayed him to be out to be, a superhero or something, but I feel like, there was a version where Zac Efron played him and he was this smiling, almost kind of misunderstood guy. And wow, that's just not, I grew up in the 70s when he was on the loose as a little kid. And I just remember how scary the whole thing was. And so I thought, if I approach this story, I want to do something that's really disturbing, because I think that the whole thing is disturbing. The whole thing is frightening and terrifying.
Yeah. And
I'm going to remember those kinds of people. I want to remember them for who they really were. And that was the beginning of it all.
Yeah, I actually just watched American Boogeyman last night, since it's on Hulu right now.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I was watching it, and I was like, it is really disturbing, because there is a few scenes that, and props to Chad Michael for...
Yeah, Chad Michael Murray, right?
Yeah, Michael Murray, there we go. Props for him to really creeping me out, because I'm like, when I do think of Ted Bundy, is there is this fascination of heroizing serial killers or killers in general, stuff like that, because they are fans of this stuff. And to give credit to him, I was like, Chad, it was he understood that this Ted Bundy is not the one that you always think about, the smiling serial killer. And you even end with the quote of him saying he's the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you ever met. And I'm just that is it's and there's a lot of these serial killer movies that do make a notion of, I wouldn't say hero, making them out to be a little more heroic in terms of their murders, but just making them more presentable in the way of Yeah,
Well, I think some of them. Yeah, I think if I may just, I feel like a lot of these films just almost gloss over the horror that they caused in the lives of the victims, victims' families, the people who survived this madness that had no motive and no reason. These girls that Bundy was targeting and murdering were doing nothing but like walking to class.
Yeah.
And he would approach them in this very like bizarre, manipulative way. And that's what he was. I mean, he was just a manipulator. And he would pretend to be handicapped and put a fake cast on, or he would or have a pair of crutches, anything to kind of like elicit sympathy. And he preyed on the good nature of these nice girls. They were just doing whatever anybody else is doing, going to class, spending a day at the beach, going to shopping. It just defies any explanation of why he kidnapped and tortured and murdered these girls the way he did.
Yeah.
So vicious and so cruel. My movie doesn't dwell so much on the act. You see very little, but I think you don't need to see all of it to know just how awful he is. And and some people, I think that's the thing, is like anytime you touch on something like this, whether it's the Sharon Tate story or this, Ted Bundy, people just get really uncomfortable and they get really angry about it. And I think part of that is it's the defense mechanism of not wanting to face truth.
Yeah.
And I think history bothers a lot of people, especially today. I don't think people want to really look at history for what it was. I think they would rather see it for what they would like it to be or to have been. I will talk about, I can get political and talk about January 6th, but I won't.
Of course.
But we all know what that was. Yeah. And to try to rewrite it and to try to sugarcoat it or put some other veneer on it, that kind of shit bothers the hell out of me. And I think that's a little bit of the reaction that I had when I approached these movies of like, no, we're not going to sugarcoat the reality. We're not going to make this into some kind of, misunderstood, kind of womanizing Lothario. It's like a guy that like women were falling all over. They weren't. He was just an average guy with an average IQ, dropped out of law school, dropped out of, anything he did, he wasn't very successful at, So I think there's this whole legend that Ted Bundy was so intelligent, and he was intelligent in the way he knew how to, make people do things, manipulate. He was a sociopath and a liar, and a really, really dangerous person who got exactly, in my opinion, what he deserved. So, and it doesn't bring, but I do think it's important that we remember history for what it was.
Yeah, sorry, your connection was a little coming in and out, but I think.
Oh, okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can still hear.
Okay.
It might be my connection because.
Okay.
So
yeah, if you ever need me to pause because it's not coming through, just let me know.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing. What I saw with your Ted Bundy movie is that there was this nasty monster underneath, and it sort of reminded me of Carrie Elway's Ted Bundy from The Riverman, where you saw this like normal, pristine, average man, and then the moment he started talking about his murders, it's just like you could just sense there was this monster underneath. And I think that's the same. Mm-hmm. That's how Chad was able to really convey into like, oh, this is the Ted Bundy that history kind of like glosses over of this. I wouldn't say like a total psychopath of, and.
Yeah. He was, and I feel like there is sort of a legend to Ted Bundy. I mean, certainly our movie takes some creative license with the story, like certain things that didn't really play out the way they happened in the film. But I would say, like, most of the facts are there. I mean, if anybody wanted to fact check me on the dates, if anybody wanted to fact check me on locations or things like that, obviously making these movies for a limited budget, we couldn't recreate, the look of every single building, which these things happen. But I think you know, if you're along for the ride, if you will, on a movie like this, I think if you look at the history of it all, the timeline matches what actually did happen.
Yeah.
You know, there wasn't in reality, you know, a McChesney who was really involved in the case. She unfortunately was not the, you know, the big hero at the end that came in to, you know, take Ted out. But I, you know, in terms of telling it for the audience, I was like, I think the audience needs this moment of confrontation and release. And I feel like because we told the story through the eyes of law enforcement, and in fact, this very real Seattle detective named Kathleen Chesney, played in our film by the wonderful Holland Rodin, that, you know, I wanted the audience to have that kind of cathartic moment. And
yeah.
What I argue is, like, you know, there are movies and there are documentaries. We're making a documentary. We're making a movie based on fact, and it's fiction based on fact. But I wanted the essence of Ted Bundy and, like you said, the evil of this man to really come through. You know, I wasn't trying to exploit him, certainly not his victims. If anything, the movie advocates for the victims. I mean, I think it mentioned the real names, you see the real photos, the slideshow in a scene earlier in the film. You know, McChesney sort of speaks for them, and I wanted her strength to carry the movie. Because she's the opposite. She's good. She's fighting for them. And I felt like if people don't want to see that, and there are those people who don't want to see anything because they've already made their mind up. But if they want to see something negative in that, then so be
Yeah,
it.
there's a great scene in the movie where Mackenzie is mad that her her department is shutting down the case, and she essentially snaps at her her captain and another another officer because of essentially Ted Bundy essentially moving out of Seattle, and they don't have like the type of thing, and she starts listing off the names of people who have died. And you could just sense that there was like there's this like venomous like anger, just like
rage, and I think that all the things that you see in the movie where she talks about, you know, they don't even have a computer, and that was the case. The only computer in the entire police department or the Seattle Sheriff's Department at that time was in the payroll department. There was no way of creating databases and comparing photos or license plate numbers. All of that work was done by hand. And so I think the lack of technology, I think we try to talk about that in the film a little bit, is kind of what impeded the investigation. I think it slowed things down drastically. Also, remember in those days, departments and various you know, heads of departments didn't speak to each other the way they do now. There was no linking one state, one town, one county to another. But just that kind of detective work didn't exist yet. So I think all of these things I tried to show in the movie, the things that made it so much more difficult to catch him.
Now, in terms of its companion movie, I say companion movie because they're essentially about two very well-known serial killers, serial killers or killers in general. With American Boogeywoman, how did you get to that? Okay, I just did a movie about Ted Bundy. Do I want to do another movie, or did it just like fall into your where a lap is like, I have another project for you. It's about AILEEN WUORNOS. So yeah, how did that project come about?
It's kind of what you just said. It was on the heels of wrapping and completing Ted Bundy, American Boogeyman, during the lockdown part of the pandemic. That was in the summer of 2020 when things were really scary and really unknown. So we were one of the very first independent films, if not the first, to be greenlit by the Screen Actors Guild to even go into production. So we were really, really careful. And we were kind of almost inventing, or I would say not so much inventing, but we were testing out these guidelines for working safely. Because obviously the actors can't have masks on when you're rolling, but in between takes, they certainly do. And, there were a lot less of the traditional, filmmaking I guess, things that, you know, you rely on. For instance, there was no makeup person on set. They had to do their own makeup between takes because you couldn't have that many bodies physically on a set. Everybody was working in little circles, you know, bubbles, and you couldn't cross in between those zones. And so we were working in this new way. And when we were successful at doing it, the people behind the Ted Bundy movie said, well, let's, you know, you guys were really successful. You did a really great job. Let's do something else. And they had this notion of the Aileen Wuornos story, which obviously had been told so compellingly and beautifully in Monster, which Charlize Theron won the Oscar for. So again, my reaction was like, why? You know, that was already done so well. Nobody can hold a candle to that performance. And what other story is there to tell? So the producer, Lucas, and I went into, you know, kind of research a little bit more. And he came back with this idea of, there was this little piece of Eileen's life that very, very few people, and I had never heard, was that when she was a very young woman in her early 20s, had made her way to small town in Florida, and she met and married this wealthy, retired elderly man named Louis Gratz Fell. And the marriage had lasted only several weeks, that there were all kinds of problems, physical abuse, things like that. She meted out on him, and she beat this poor old man with his own cane. She had stolen money and, you know, was involved in bar fights and brawls. And, you know, the seeds of Eileen's anger, her rage, were planted at a very, very young age when she was abused by her old grandfather, at least, and was selling her body at 12, 13. I mean, just horrible life. And so the idea of this movie was, what could that marriage have been? What was that chapter of her life all about? And the movie kind of jumps off into that, the older Aileen in prison, kind of telling the story, but as the older and much more, you know, emotionally, mentally unstable Aileen would have done, where she kind of is telling it in a way to make it more interesting, make it more sexy, if you will. And so the story is kind of told from this unreliable narrator, and going into her past and looking at this very short period of her life when she married this man, played by the amazing
Tobin
Bell from the Saw films. And we're just so grateful that Tobin agreed to it. But yeah, that was the impetus.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about the casting for both American Boogeyman and Boogeywoman, because it is still a casting, to say at least, because again, props to Chad Michael Murray for playing an amazing Ted Bundy, because
thank you, and I know that would mean a lot to him.
You know, and
really hard on it and wanted to play it in a way that was not your kind of typical you know, sexy guy kind of way.
And you know, it's funny because I remember when the movie was first announced to be released for like a one night only type of screening or a limited release, I was reading on Twitter and people are like, why is Hollywood still sexifying Ted Bundy? And I'm just like, and I'm looking at a picture of both Ted Bundy and Chad's version of Ted Bundy. I'm like, I can still see it, but it's like he still looks like a man in the 70s, where it's like in the 70s, people really did look like that. So it's like,
they did. Yeah. I mean, I think there were some funny comments I had read, you know, because people just want to hate on everything. I just ignore the internet. I think I told you before. I don't read a thing anymore. It's a viper pit of nasty.
Oh yeah, it is.
So I don't even bother. It's just useless to try to win any of these people over. It's unhappy, miserable, you know, people who just want to sit behind their computer and be mad. So I'm like, great, you go be mad and we'll go make movies. But that being said, I mean, there were some complaints or criticisms that Chad was wearing this terrible wig. Well, surprise, that was his real hair. We didn't have money and time for putting a wig on this man. So what you saw was Chad Michael Murray's hair made into like a 70s male hairdo, you know, with curling irons and pressing irons, you know, things to make his hair look wavier. But that is actually his
and to bring up the next point with AILEEN, how did casting of Peyton List come about? Because I know at the time of probably filming, she may or may not have been filming Cobra, Cobra Kai season 4. So I'm not sure if that was like sandwiched in like a little gap between of her break in filming of the show, or right before it, went back into filming.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. She had a very short break between her Cobra Kai seasons, and God love her. I just watched the most recent season 4. She kind of steals the show in a lot of ways.
I'm literally in the middle of season 4 as of right now. So I'm like,
are you still? Well, I don't want to give anything away, but it's kind of, in a way, it's kind of, maybe it's a little bit her season. I'll say that. But she's just wonderful, and we had a great time working together. And we were lucky to get her because she just happened to have this little weeks before she had to go back to Atlanta to start shooting season 4 of Cobra Kai. So it was great to just have somebody that young and excited and game for everything. She brought a lot of great energy to our project. She was always fun to be with. Lots of jokes. And, it's a kind of a heavy subject matter, but this one was a little different from the Ted Bundy thing, where we were really kind of going into this dark place, some of that. And whereas the AILEEN WUORNOS movie was more of like a, it's kind of like a telling of a tall tale, and it's getting bigger and bigger as the older AILEEN is telling it. So none of it's supposed to be taken literally. But, because it had a slightly, it was, the tone is dark, but it's not dark in the way of a Ted Bundy. But because of that, I think we just had a little more fun on that set, and I think we were more relaxed. The pressure was on. Both of these movies were made in 12 days. That was
12 days
for the budget. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so
so it's 12 days each. That's how much time we had. 12 days to shoot each one.
Wow.
Tell me about it. Tell me. I know. It was a lot of planning.
Back to the casting, though. How did the casting of Holland Rosen come about to play essentially the heroic antagonist against Bundy?
Yep. Well, I wanted, I wrote the role for somebody who was a little bit small in stature, not a big, strong, powerful woman. I wanted somebody, who would look in contrast to Bundy, who, wasn't the biggest guy, but I wanted her to look vulnerable. She worked in a male-dominated profession at the time. Not too many women were doing the job that the real McChesney was doing. So because it was based on a real woman, it was important for me to find a young actress who could bring a strength to it, but still seem very vulnerable. And like, it's me against all this stuff. And Holland came in, and she was recommended, and I can't remember who. I think it may have been her agent or somebody involved maybe with our show. Don't remember how that happened, but I just remember I met her, and it was all kind of like this over Zoom. And we spoke, and she was working out of town at that point. I saw something in her. I liked her kind of gravelly, kind of Demi Moore kind of voice. She seemed a little tough to me, but also very sweet. She has a very, girl next door kind of vibe to her. And she also did some great work in Teen Wolf.
Oh, yeah.
And I just, I knew she had a bit of a fan following, and it just made sense. And she really, the thing is, she grasped onto what this character was. And it was funny, she had told me a story that there was another true story that she was supposed to have been involved in. She was supposed to play the lead in. And it didn't happen. And then this came to her, and she's like, oh, wow, maybe I was meant to do this. And it all worked out.
Now, you mentioned the 12-day each production for the thing. And you could tell that with it, especially with Ted Bundy, you could tell you were trying to figure out ways to not only film in a way that feels, not 2020-ish, but at least 2020. Because there are like recent films that were filmed before or after the 2020 bubble that have essentially, actors separated, maybe a few feet apart, not close. So as a director, especially with the time frame you had for both films, like what was the production, like how close were you essentially have with your production where it's like, okay, this is the pre-production phase, what, I'm on set. Not on pre-production phase. I'm on the production phase. I'm on set. How do I position actors? Not closely and everything because
yeah. I mean, I think like I was saying earlier, we were kind of guinea pigs, for this new way of working. And like you said, there are lots of scenes, and you'll see it in current TV shows where the actors are not close quarters with each other. You see there's really a distance a lot of times between them. Now I think people have gotten better over the past, couple of years. It's kind of tricking the audience more to make it seem like, oh, he's right on the other side of the table. So I think a lot of it was honestly just shooting in creative ways. Sometimes it was having reactions that were being shot separately from a master shot, for instance. But we tried to really limit, the contact between actors and crew. Especially, it was when the actors had their masks down, we felt like that was the most vulnerable. So we just made sure the set was clear. The only people on set were the ones who needed to be there. We didn't have a script supervisor, which was, dangerous because, you don't have somebody keeping the continuity. Didn't have a lot of the typical traditional people on set that you normally see. Usually there's a makeup artist right off camera waiting to jump in between takes, and they'll dab. If you look at the Ted Bundy movie, and specifically, there's a scene early, and she goes into the bullpen where all the investigators, the police are, and they're investigating the Bundy. It's like a task force room, and you can just see the sweat all over the actors' faces. It's like a 98-degree day in Pomona, California, where we shot it, and there was nobody there to make them look perfect. So you just see some of the flaws. I mean, if you look closely, you can see it. Like there's sweat on their upper lip, and and the actors are very conscious and self-conscious about it. But we let everybody know going in, like, this is not going to be the way it usually is. It just can't. So yeah, it was that kind of preparation of trying to minimize contact between the crew and the cast.
Yeah, and going forward with what you learned and what you did on American Boogeyman, how did the next film, American Boogeywoman, do? Whereas, like, was it the same exact methods, or did you have because I know that like after around September 2020, like that's when there was like a new I wouldn't, like that's when like Howard had like a new version of sort of like how to film in a COVID bubble type of thing.
Well, that was already discussed and kind of created on paper. We were one of the very first ones to test it out, like I said. So that's, so it was a weird time. That's all I can say. But by this, so we shot the Boogeyman, I want to say July of 2020, and then by December we were already shooting Boogeywoman. So all of that work and all the planning, and including all the writing of the scripts, all happened in that time. So, I didn't have a lot of, while people were kind of like hunkering down in their homes, I was working night and day trying to get these things off the ground, so it just wasn't a lot of time. But by December when we shot, and like I said, we only had people for a very short window, and we're just glad to get her for those, I think 10 days that we had her. But that being said, it was, I think we just took what we learned that we were successful at doing from the first one. We brought it to the second one. We actually brought even some of the same crew back from Bundy onto the Aileen project. So it was just, we all had a kind of working relationship and a flow in which to keep everybody safe. So that's what we did. We just repeated the same formula.
Because there are moments where in both films there are people that are either kissing or having simulated sex or something like that. When you had to do it, especially since a lot of the times now especially with theater, I had conversations with my fellow actors and actresses who are still like worried about doing intimate theater, intimate theater. So when you had to say, okay, non-spoilers, but there's a scene in Ted Bundy where he imagines himself having a pleasure zone, and he
way of putting it.
Yeah, he has a pleasure zone, and he has like all these like masked women with like bondage gear and stuff like that too.
Right,
and
right.
There's a scene in Boogeywoman where Jennifer's character, the character Jennifer walks in and sees her father having sex with AILEEN. So when it had to come up with those two, like, and of course with AILEEN being someone who was working as a prostitute, or with Ted Bundy who killed women like very intimate,
in a very close, intimate way. Right.
How did those?
I know what you're saying.
Yeah, how did those like intimate moments on film come about, especially with the protocol of
I will tell you what it was, and it's a very simple answer. It's testing. It was testing. Testing. We had our own, and for a very small budget movie, it took a big dent. We took a big dent in our budget, which is why the movie had to be done in 12 days, as opposed to say 15 or 18. It was the added cost of testing the entire cast and crew on a almost daily basis. And when you take a test for one person being about $150 times 40, 50 people every day or every 2 days, that money adds up real fast.
Oh yeah.
So, but we had we had COVID supervisors, we had a nurse, we had people specifically hired on set to make sure that everybody was social distanced, that people had their masks on, that people weren't, having conversations off camera that were close to one another. Just to really, again, it was all for safety. That was our number one concern. You have to remember these, the crew, like my first AD, Paul, great guy. He's got 2 little kids at home. He didn't want to go home and, bring COVID into his family.
Yeah.
Nobody did. So we were just when we worked, and we weren't going out at night after. We weren't like, everybody agreed we're going to get this movie done and we're going to keep each other safe. We're not going to interact with the outside world unless we absolutely have to. And that's how we made it work.
Now, you mentioned you kind of mentioned before, and that AILEEN, American Boogeywoman has sort of like a very tall tale type of story going for it. Because as I was watching, I was like, this is kind of campy, but in a good, entertaining way.
Right. It definitely goes a little bit into like campiness. Yes.
Like almost soap opera-y, but
yes.
But as I was watching it, there was like elements of Psycho and elements of Cape Fear.
Sure.
Was that intentional of you writing the story? Like, because
for sure. No, it wasn't, because we don't know anything about that time. It's not like Bundy where we can, intimate, even though we weren't, we don't know exactly the details of everything that happened when he murdered 4 innocent girls. This part of AILEEN's life, I mean, if you look on any retrospective, any documentary, any book that's been written about her, there are no details about this point of her life. So we kind of had to make up everything. I thought, if we have to make up everything, then it should be AILEEN making it up, or AILEEN making it up. And I think the fact that she was kind of, as a young girl, was always taken with these very strong femme fatale characters in these black and white noir movies, from Barbara Stanwyck and Gardner to, on and on and on. It's like kind of powerful women in movies. And I thought, maybe she tells the story thinking of herself as one of those characters. That makes it kind of more interesting. So that's why it's told in the way it is. And as the movie goes on, it becomes more of a fantasy. Yeah,
and there's even a point where her documentary, the filmmaker, interviewing her.
Right, the guy that's playing the guy who's sent to the prison to interview her. Right.
Yeah, it's like how he even literally goes like, like how much of this is really true, and
and yep.
something along those lines.
Oh yeah, he's kind of humoring her because he wants to, this is her supposedly her final interview, and it's a little very loosely based on a guy that did interview her shortly before her death. Famous documentarian. He he did go to the prison and did it. But in this incarnation of it, it's a vehicle, and it's a method to try to get this story out of in this movie. Like if Aileen Wuornos, very damaged, emotionally damaged human being, obviously, were to tell somebody as part of her story. And by the way, we have to remember too, by the time, even before she died, people were making book and movie deals using her name.
Yeah.
And knowing that she was going to be dead, sentenced to death, they were already, people in her orbit were trying to profit off of that. And so I thought part of her rage was that people were making up stories about her. So she's kind of like, well, fuck you. I'm going to make up a story. Want to listen to this? And so that's kind of what the movie is. If she were to tell that in that state of mind that she was in at the end of her life, how would she have? That's kind of what the movie is. That's the jumping off point. Yeah.
Basically, her getting the last laugh of saying, hey, this could all be true, but you would never know because you never really heard.
Exactly. It's Aileen, giving a finger to the system. And to those who might exploit her. And I think the irony is maybe it's exploitative to tell a story about her at all. But I thought, this is a really interesting chapter of this woman's life. And what interested me most was it was like a fork in the road of her life.
Yeah.
Here she was, this very young, damaged girl, but here she was given an opportunity to change all of it by finding this other man who very much, I believe, was in love with her and offered her a life that she probably never, and probably that most people would never get that opportunity. Yet here it was. And what did she do? She kind of resorted to her natural state of mind.
Yeah.
It's it's like that old saying, like hurt people hurt people.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what it was that she was already so damaged that she couldn't kind of stop herself from hurting even a man who had her best interests at heart, allegedly. There was no report that he did anything untoward or violent toward her. In fact, she directed all the violence toward him. So I think that the seeds of her insanity were already
now. No, I heard you. I was just trying to think of my next.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Because my next question was about what you just said before, which was the movies that they were making about her, and Monster was a brilliant movie, and like when you were making this movie, it's like, and you mentioned this before, it's like what else is there to tell? So when you were making the movie, it's like, how were you trying to make this movie not similar to Monster, where it's like they kind of play up the whole the serial killing nature of her killing men and stuff like that too. And there is other media where Aileen is in the there's season, I think it's season 5 of American Horror Story, and
yes, right, she kind of visits the hotel, I believe.
Long story short about that, she's a ghost, and she happens to know that the guy who owns the building. Again, long story short,
right,
and they kind of play up more along the lines of, and Lily Rabe is a fantastic actress.
Lily Rabe, did it right. She also played Aileen. Yes, you're right.
Yeah. And they kind of do play up the whole notion of the monster influence. And when I was watching it, I wasn't really seeing like there was an influence of it, but it was more along the lines of what I just said before, where what you and I were saying before is where she's telling her own story. So it's just kind of like elaborating on that.
Yeah, she's building it with, it's like the game of telephone that just keeps growing and growing with each, it's like she's stringing this guy along, obviously.
But when you were making the film, it's like, did you like, what was the conversation you had with Peyton to say, okay, don't make it like Charlize Theron, just make Eileen your own type of character, because she is a very proactive character in the movie, but at the same time, the older Eileen is kind of like really, like what you just said before, like telling the thing along, and I'm just like yeah, like what was the conversations you had where it's like, don't try and make it like this, just keep it like, there we go. Like, don't try and make it like this.
Well, it's just what you said. It's exactly the conversations you had. You just said it. It's don't try to emulate another actor's performance, whether it's Charlize or anybody else who's tackled this role. Just make it who interpret that your way. Don't try to put on a whole song and dance with this. I mean, I think that Peyton's toughness certainly comes through in the movie, but also that she's this kind of sad person.
Yeah.
Something really at her heart that's gone terribly wrong in her life. And she's a victim from almost the day she was born. And I think that she brought that. She wasn't trying to kind of act like anyone else. She just, knowing that the movie was kind of, she was the fantasy Eileen.
Yeah.
She saw herself as maybe much prettier than she actually was back in those days. Maybe she saw herself as smarter. She wanted to portray herself in this. Again, it's the real Eileen, if you will, telling a fanciful version of her own and what those events might have been like. Again, like that history books don't tell us.
Yeah. Now, speaking of history, well, in history books, I should talk about the previous two films that are sort of like the same sort of companion pieces, where one is about the haunting of Sharon Tate, and the other murder of Nicole Brown Simpson. I only heard about both of them because of its controversy of the quote unquote exploitation of the quote unquote exploitation of everything. Yep. And if that was exploitation, I mean, honestly, if that was exploitation, then half of the movies on Lifetime would be essentially exploitation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, again, it was an easy target. Easy. And I look back on it and I just think, wow. I have a long list of movies that you want to call them exploitation. Go ahead. And I guess Titanic was exploitative because 1,500 people drowned in the Titanic. I guess that was exploitation.
Yeah. So it's kind of like weird how people.
They decide, and I think the culture we're in a place where everything's quote problematic.
Yeah.
Everything is a problem. Everything is offensive.
But
all of this stuff, all of these reactions are a choice. They're reactions of people who kind of maybe don't want to deal with their own trauma, who don't want to look at history for what it was, or maybe what it could have been. Like in the case of Haunting of Sharon Tate and and American Boogeywoman have some interesting parallels. They're both fantasies. Neither are meant to be taken literally. Neither are meant to be telling the audience this is the way it really happened. But yet, they want to, the critics, if you will, and the haters, they want to jump on them because that's not how it happened. Well, it's like, well, that's not supposed to be the way it happened. This is a fantasy told through a different lens. It's either the distorted lens of an older Eileen facing her own death for crimes that she committed, or in the case of the Haunting of Sharon Tate, they're all earthbound spirits who are trying to work out for themselves how the hell they ended up here. And that's what the movie's about. But for those people who want to say, that's not what happened, to defend these movies, and I will, but I won't, because I'm kind of like, if you want to get that hung up on things, I can give you about 150 examples of things you might want to get angry about as well.
Yeah. Now, I bring up the conversation. I bring up the controversy, and when you're releasing a movie and there's a little bit of a controversy behind it, does that make people want to go see the movie more, or does that hurt the revenue of the box office, or is it a mixture of both bag?
Well, it's funny. People have reported that they killed the box office, but there was no box office. I mean, these movies were never theatrical films.
Oh, okay.
So, never intended for that. No, the movies were all successful.
Nice.
And I don't know if it's because of the haters. I mean, maybe we should thank them. I didn't make a lot of money. What people also fail to point out is that my directing fee, certainly on the first couple movies, went to victims' charities. So for anybody that accuses me of exploitation or lining my pockets, well, go fuck yourself. So yeah, it's just funny how people think they know who you are. They know what your motives are. They want to judge you as a human being, and I'm just over it. I'm too old for it. I don't have time for it. If people want to live in that bubble of judgment, hatred, and misunderstanding, then that's up to them.
But yeah, there is something that I did enjoy or saw was interesting, was that in both of those movies, the villain, with Sharon Tate, the villain of Charles Manson, and the villain of O.J. Simpson, they kind of kept in the shadows. It's like that, right. Especially with Manson, where it's like you don't see him like at all. It's like you see him like through the shadows, or he's like out of frame or out of focus. But with OJ, OJ, shows up like an hour into the movie. It's like, oh, it's a movie about
there he is.
Yeah, like when you were writing that, did you have that in mind that okay, these aren't movies about this isn't a movie about OJ. This is not about a movie about
right. Exactly right. Yeah, I wasn't trying to make a biopic about O.J. Simpson or any of these people. It's not a biopic. This isn't a documentary. It's not what these movies are. These movies are interesting kind of what ifs.
Yeah.
Like, what if Nicole, because there was the story that Nicole Brown had met this man as kind of like a handyman. This guy named Glenn Rogers, who was later arrested as being this notorious serial killer, the bedroom killer, or the cross-country killer. And that, if she had, what would that maybe have been? I remember like somebody else like went off on the fact that there's a whole scene where she's like being dragged across the ceiling, and it's very kind of like a Nightmare on Elm Street thing.
Yeah,
and it's like let me tell you what it is. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare.
Kind of explicit, because one, like after everything, it kind of like pans over to her, kind of like still sleeping in the tub. So I was like, oh, so he is having a nightmare.
Well, and I think what it was, and again, that wasn't a script that I wrote. It came to me. But I feel like that scene and what it symbolizes was her growing paranoia, her fear of that she was in danger all the time. And I think that's kind of what it spoke to. Again, like I laugh at the literalists who think she didn't get dragged across the ceiling.
No, it was just...
Well, of course she didn't. But, there are those who get angry because they think that I'm trying to say that happened. No, she had a nightmare. And in fact, I think Nicole did in some of her, some of the books that were written about her, and some of the people that knew her had said that she was having these like very strong, almost like, I hate to say like psychic premonitions. It wasn't that, but I think she just felt she wasn't safe. Like she had got one of her best friends was Chris Kardashian, and she had said to Chris not long before she died that if anything happens to me, just take care of my kids. So like there was maybe almost like a sixth sense that something was going to happen. I think she always felt in danger of a threat of life from OJ, and who is guilty of sin. I mean, the movie never says he's not guilty.
Yeah,
it just says, what if there was somebody else who maybe tried to get her first? If you look at that scene, and I hate looking at that scene, it's something that I kind of fought against, and it was something that the producers kind of insisted. I didn't want to shoot a murder scene. I want to believe it very much in the minds of the audience of what might have happened. But the compromise was we don't show the face. And I almost felt like, well, that's kind of a disservice because we all know who did it. But I think for the purposes of the movie and what the producers felt, they needed to have that. So sort of had to go along with what they wanted. But I did like that. And I will say that I think what's interesting about it, though, is it leaves the question of how did that all play out that night? And the ones that I just feel horrible for are those kids, you know, and I wonder how they're doing today.
Yeah.
Can imagine going through life knowing dad murdered your mom. I just don't know what that would be like. So it just, that part gives me pause and makes me really, bow my head and really reflect on it, and it makes me very sad.
Yeah, it does really make it sad because these were real people and these were real murders, and
and it was that was really the reason why I wanted to do something for charity. When this movie came out, because I knew people would be all up in arms, and of course they were. And they're like, "Do you know what people are saying?" And I'm like, "Well, people are going to say what they want to say." But I knew where my heart was. I know where it is. I know what kind of person I am. And I think when you bring up questions, people get uncomfortable. They don't like it.
But yeah, now I grew up in the 90s, so I really don't remember. I mean, I really remember the OJ trial, but I don't really remember the impact that it had. When you were making this film, were you pulling bits and pieces of the stuff that you really recall back in the 90s? Because I figured this would be this was an event that you
Well, it was in my own backyard. I was living in Los Angeles when it happened. I mean, that was a troublesome year, 1994, 93, 94. We had Rodney King incident, which was the very first time, to any great degree, that the police were caught, terrorizing and beating a poor, a man who had just basically been pulled over for a traffic stop. That became a huge controversy. We had a giant earthquake. We had floods. We had, you name it.
Yeah.
And then the OJ thing. Just everything was happening in a kind of cataclysmic way. It felt like around that time. But I will tell you this is kind of strange trivia, but I remember specifically I was writing the screenplay for Halloween 6 when that Bronco chase went on.
Oh, really?
I remember I stopped writing and looked up at the TV, and there was O.J. Simpson in his white Bronco racing down the 405 during rush hour on, I think it was a Friday night, being chased by, a phalanx of Los Angeles Police Department.
Yeah, essentially the fire department.
It was a circus. It was you couldn't believe this was happening. And you have to remember too, I grew up, I'm older than you. O.J. was a national hero. He was to us kids in the 70s, all of these. He was the football player we all loved, and he kind of did transcend race. Nobody looked at him like the black guy OJ. He was just everybody. He was an American pastime hero, that everybody looked up to. He was the guy in the funny commercials about the Hertz rent-a-car, and he'd run through the airport, and that was funny. As kids, we all looked up to him, and he was acting. He was in the Naked Gun movies and making this very funny. He was in the Towering Inferno much earlier. So he was a really accepted and revered part of the creative community and sports community, obviously. But so the shock of that, to see that there's this hero, this national hero, basically running for his life with a gun in his mouth, days after his ex-wife and her friend had been stabbed to death. I mean, horribly. It was just a circus. It was horrible. And yeah, so that's my memory of it. And of course, you want them. You're going to retell that story, and it's just a sensitive one. And if there's one that I maybe regret, it might be that one, just because it just feels.
Yeah, it is. But
I just don't, and some of it is because I had creative differences with people involved, and some of it was the script I don't feel like was baked enough. But I also feel like there's just one. That's just one that I feel like we could have done better. But anyway, yeah. But again, what I don't regret is that we told the story, and that hopefully that some of the money that went to charities helped people who needed help. And so for those reasons, I'm like, okay.
Now this might be a weird question, but when you did finish the film, did you feel like a sense of catharsis?
Catharsis?
Yeah, catharsis.
Mm-hmm.
About it, because
I don't know. I don't know if I felt cathartic about it. I kind of felt like, oh, this is going to rile people up. You know, I think there's good, you know, I knew going in, you know, because everybody's a hater these days. So like immediately I knew there's going to be that. But I you know what, I guess I didn't quite, you know, anticipate was kind of their reaction of I don't know. I guess it's all the same. It was just a very negative knee-jerk reaction to the movie, and I didn't not understand it. The Haunting of Sharon Tate, I didn't understand it because I knew that movie was very much about victims rising up, and claiming, you know, their justice for themselves.
Yeah.
And you know, even that didn't. So I thought to myself, well, this is not going to go over well. But I was interested in, you know, Nicole as a mother, you know, and what kind of person she was. And I hopefully there's moments in that movie where we show the tenderness she had and the love she had for her children and her friends, and that she was a very vulnerable woman living in a not great situation. So hopefully that stuff comes through in the movie. And I thought Mina was sensitive to it. Miss Uvari played her. That's a dangerous role for any actress. She took it on, and and I thought she was brave, and I think she did a good job. I think it's just a tough one, and I think there's certain topics like that just don't sit well with people, and I get it. I do get it.
Yeah, and I think it's also what you went back to before, or what we touched upon before, which is essentially that cult of celebrityism, where it's like when it's a famous person or famous, you know, when a famous person commits a shocking crime, it shocks people to the core, and it's something that you said before, where it's like you don't want to read it in the history books of like the true facts and everything, and with this movie, it's like you do get the sensation of you're not really sure what happens in the end, but you are leaning towards of, okay, yeah, he did it, or but I
mean, I think the thing with the Glenn Rogers, I think that threw people. I think they didn't like that we were intimating that somebody else could have been involved. Listen, I didn't say he killed her or he didn't. I think, and I don't think the movie's saying that. I think it's just saying there were people in and around Nicole's life, her orbit, that may not have been the best people. There are many stories and accounts of, you know, that Nicole was heavily involved in drugs at a period of her life. I don't know if it was that period, but there was a period in which she was. You know, there was this restaurant that she frequented, you know, was apparently known for kind of being a drug kind of running. You know, it's long gone as a cafe in Brentwood, in a very expensive neighborhood, but was kind of catering to the drug habits of the rich and famous. You know, it was almost like a front for that. That's the allegation. I don't know if that's true. And I think one of the waiters there was later killed in some sort of drug like that. This was after the Nicole and Ron tragedy. So yeah, I just feel for the families. I feel for the kids. I just, the whole thing is just so unsavory and awful. And you know, maybe in retrospect, putting that out there in any way, shape, or form isn't a good thing. But you know, I also think we didn't try to make it into like, oh, Nicole was this terrible woman, terrible mother, insensitive. You know, she was just a human being. You know, she made mistakes. She had affairs. She did things that, you know, maybe she wasn't proud of, but she's still a human being. She didn't, neither she nor Ron Goldman didn't deserve what happened. Horrible thing.
Yes. And of course, you know, I'm sorry if I brought it up, but I just needed to talk about the controversy again.
Of course, you know, I get it, and you know, it's just something I feel like maybe
that you just needed to bring it off to your chest.
No pun intended. That one's gonna haunt me for a while, you know, and I feel like that's part of the reason I've kind of made a conscious decision to kind of pull away from these kinds of stories. I mean, I've done a few of them. You know, I'm not angry that I did them, but I think in retrospect, you know, I would rather move forward into things that I think make people happier. I don't want to spend the rest of my life with this legacy of like just drumming up terrible incidents from, dark pieces of history. I mean, what I've done is what I've done, but at the same time, I feel like it's a good time for me to put a lid on that and move into other things.
So you finally got to do a lighthearted family comedy next.
A lighthearted, yes, an animated film, sure.
Yes, but or go back to documentary, or go back to documentaries, and I know,
I've got a couple of those in the works, and and I'll never give up my love of the horror genre,
But doing like movies like this almost like back to back, it does like where you go out and you're kind of like, and it just goes, I feel like I made my mark on some of these movies, and I think you had made your mark with, especially with these movies, and I do think that like the story is there. Is like you definitely, if you watch these movies, like the story is there, and you just need to like watch it with an open mind and stuff like that too, and see that these are movies where it's like these are fiction movies. These are these are still fiction since it is a movie.
It's a movie. It's fiction based on fact, whatever you want to call it. But it's the thing that obviously there's that group of people that want to that these were real people's lives. Well, sure. I mean, name a movie based on a true story that wasn't about somebody. They all were. I don't know anybody who's ever made a movie where there's, they want to make a movie that targets victims and makes them out to be terrible human beings. For those people who say that, I'm like, get your head checked. That's not, watch the movie again and watch it, outside of your sphere of anger that you've created for yourself. It's not what I made at all. Never. I would never make something like that. Yeah. Who would? I mean, who would make a movie saying that poor Sharon Tate and her friends deserve what they got? But there are those critics who've said that that's what I did. It's absolutely, that stuff makes me think of there's something really intrinsically wrong with the people writing those kinds of reviews. Like there's something wrong with them. Like, and I wouldn't want to be in a room alone with them because I think that they're disturbed. If that's what they see.
But yeah, and to bounce back off of this, and I do want to bring up a short documentary or television documentary that you did in honor of its release that's coming. Well, as right now, I'm recording this. It's almost out in theaters. Well, it's right before it's the theater. Actually, it should already be out because it's Thursday, and they do Thursday releases and stuff like that too. But Scream, aka Scream 5, those who are keeping count. Being released in theaters, but you also did a TV documentary for A&E called Scream: The Inside Story. Could you talk about a little bit about not only the production for that, but also creating a short documentary thing for the A&E channel, especially for Scream? I'm going on the Wayback Machine here a little bit. It's a long time ago. I think it was around 20. When did Scream 4 come out? It was 2011? Yeah, 2011. 11 years. So we did. I can't believe it, man. It's just I feel like it's like an episode of like This Is Your Life at this point. I can't believe only me would bring this up. Like, hey, no, I think it's great. I'm honored that you remembered it. So we had done, myself and my kind of creative posse had done a documentary that was really well received called Never Sleep Again, Elm Street. Like this was like the very first, I think, fan-inspired documentary to chronicle the making of, the beloved horror franchise that is Elm Street. And we did that on our own. And I always said by the fans and for the fans. We did it as a labor of love. There was no financial backing behind it. We just threw everything that we had on the screen. And we're lucky to get so many people who were involved with the movies to come and support the cause. So it was on the success of that documentary on Never Sleep Again that we had actually sold the television rights to A&E for that show. Oh, really? And this, so the way that the Scream show came about was because of that. The people who had bought the Elm Street legacy for A&E said, "Would you like to do something else?" And Scream 4 was being talked about. It wasn't, I don't think it was yet in production. Maybe it had just wrapped, but it was still early. Yeah. And
And I said, well, what if we did something on screen? And, you know, there's a new movie that's going to be coming out within the year. You should really jump on that. And the people at A&E agreed. And so suddenly we were like a go project because there was a limited time in which to get this done. They wanted to release, actually premiere the show like the week before Scream 4 opened. It was all timing. But that's where that started. And thankfully, you know, the brilliant and wonderful late Wes Craven, who had, you know, been so generous with us when we did the Elm Street documentary, he was more than happy to participate in our Scream documentary. And I was like, Wes, we have money this time. So we don't have to hang a green screen in the middle of your office. We can, you know, we have our own little, you know, studio, which is what we did. I'm not kidding. We like hung a green screen in his corner, in the corner of his office, and Lito Velasco, who did everything. He wore all these hats on these shows. He like held the boom mic for 3 hours above Wes's head. I don't know if he's ever recovered from that, but so that's how that started. And thankfully we had the blessing of Wes and at the time Miramax convention at the studio that, you know, released the movies. And you know, we got a lot of people. The thing with Inside Story, which was an ongoing series that Bio Channel had been doing, they really wanted to focus on the original. So ours didn't so much like get into the sequels of Scream at that time. It touched on them at the end as kind of like, yeah, there was a Scream 2, 3, and boy, there's going to be a 4. But the most of the show, the hour and a half, I think was dedicated to the concept, the making, and the release of the first Scream. So that's what that was all about. Yeah, and it was great. You know, listen, we got to meet so many of the people involved. And it was just always a thrill. You know, we created this really set that looked kind of like the Woodsboro School, and it was just fun, you know, to have everybody from the production designer to obviously the awesome cast to, you know, obviously it goes without saying, but having Wes in the room at any time was always just awesome. And there's no other word.
Yeah, especially
it was just so wonderful. It was so nice, you know. And the funniest thing is that he earned this reputation as like the king of horror when he was just the nicest man, and couldn't have been sweeter, kinder, more generous to all of us. And it was an honor. I get a little teary thinking about it. He was so kind to all of us.
Now, and he will always be missed because he is like one of the great all-time.
Oh my God!
All-time creators in horror movies, and it's just amazing to know. There's like, oh, he didn't start out as a horror movie, you know, director. He was just like, in his own words, just like this kid coming out of like a Christian college.
Oh yeah, no, he came from a really devout, you know, I want to say a Lutheran background, something like that. But it was, you know, and I don't think he said he even had a TV. He saw a TV until he was a teenager. But I think, you know, I think a lot of people who grew up in repression find outlets for that. I think I did too. I think part of my story was I was raised in a very Catholic household, and you know, I don't want to get on a soapbox, but I think a lot of religion is fear-based, you know, and I think that people, the more religious and maybe more devout, more extremist type of religious people use fear to control.
Yeah. Like
their children, their congregation, their parish, you know, and I you know, listen, I don't want to get into that conversation. However, I think that the people who who've gone through these experiences and come through the other side, I think that you're always left with a mark. And I think that we're always the sum total of our parts, you know, of our history. And I think that Wes was in a way working out some of that stuff through his movies.
Oh yeah. And you know, I grew up Catholic, and I'm what we call a lapsed Catholic. You know.
Yeah, me too. Yeah,
I'm still recovered. I'm still Catholic by faith, but you know, if there's ever a moment where I go, okay, I gotta go to church for a couple of seconds to dissolve my sin.
I feel you, man. I do. I grew up in the Catholic Church myself. Unfortunately, I had some, you know, in particular, a very close friend of mine growing up was abused by one of the priests at our church. I won't get into those horrible details, but there's a darkness to some of that, and I think that that the survivors of abuse and trauma have to find a way to coexist in the world in a way that can face the day. And sometimes those nightmares that we have, like the Freddy Kruegers, are a manifestation of childhood trauma.
Oh yeah, and I think that is
it's probably why so many people relate to these characters. When I think about it too, I think that the Freddys, the Michael Myers, I think they all kind of represent that shadow of our past. And collectively, we all experience trauma in our lives. We do. And I think it's why so many people get upset when you confront them with it. It's something like an abusive or a Manson, not to circle back to these other things that make people, I think sometimes when you put a fake front on it, like a Freddy or a Michael, that's okay.
Yeah.
But when you start to kind of peel the layers back and show them real shit, that's when people go like, oh no, that's I don't want to look at that. That makes me uncomfortable because there's something about it that triggers trauma in there.
And I believe on that note is a great way to end this episode. Because, in a way, or in a message, or in a tone, really, a lot of the 4 films that we spoke of really does spoke of not only victims fighting back, but also just like unleashing this trauma of this. It's like, unleashing this trauma that we all have in the society.
Right.
And it's sort of like, it's basically like going to therapy, where it's just like, in therapy, that your therapist and yourself, you talk about your trauma, and it's basically about healing from your trauma. And sometimes people want to be healed from the trauma, but there are people who don't want to be healed from the trauma. And whenever the Band-Aid is ripped open, it's like they have to put the Band-Aid back on, and, and
right.
They act out.
And they scream really loud. They get real angry. They get real aggressive. And I get it. We've all lived through something traumatic. We've all had, I think we all know a victim. We're all, in a sense, touched by the violence in this society. We're all touched by the indifference that people have. We're, acts of terror and horror. Children going to school through metal detectors and having drills of what to do if somebody comes in and shoots up the school. These are horrors that we all live with the knowledge of, and yet we kind of still just shrug our shoulders to some of it. Yet I know somebody who's well known in the horror industry whose child was shot in a school shooting a couple of years ago, and I don't think that they'll ever get over it. And so I think that we as a society, as a collective, that we're all kind of licking those wounds and finding ways, like you said, to put a band-aid on that, just so that we can get up and get out of bed. There are days when I'm sure lots of us, I've had those days, especially during this pandemic and the lockdown and the uncertainty and everything changes from minute to minute. Now it's this and now it's the other, and nobody knows what to believe, and everybody's pointing fingers at the other person. It's so crazy. And I think we're all just trying to figure out how to navigate our lives. So I think that maybe horror and maybe movies that point a finger at some of these horrors of real life, I think they make people either feel very uncomfortable or they empower them to face their own. So it's an either or situation, but I think there's a place for all of it. I just think that people have to decide for themselves how they want to read.
Yeah, and on that note, thank you, Daniel, for being another great guest and speaking about.
Thanks. No, thanks for having me again. It's always nice to connect with you. I hope you're doing well and staying safe.
I am.
All those things. Good.
Yeah, I have.
I was going to say, keep it that way. Stay that way. Stay safe. Good to the people around you, and that's all we can ask, right?
Yeah. And on that note, please take care, everyone. Please stay safe and be well. And
thanks, man. All right, we'll be in touch.